But I always think it's a good idea to know a little bit about the person that you've come to see, to get a feel for them, so that you have some perspective in which to consider their remarks. So let me start by saying our speaker is the epitome of an award-winning journalist. He's received from the Washington Post the inaugural Ben Bradley Prize in honor of relentless and courageous pursuit of the truth. He's won numerous honors, including the Everett McKinley Dirksen Award for his coverage of Congress, and the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award for his coverage of the nation's capital. Of course, the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting is journalism's most prestigious award. It's been awarded since 1948, and in 2017, the 70th year of its presentation, it was given to our speaker. I think I just screwed up your, yes, okay. It was given to David for persistent reporting that created a model for transparent journalism in political campaign coverage while casting doubt on Donald Trump's assertions of generosity toward charities. All of that, okay? You know the basics about the man. He is Texas-born and Harvard-educated. He honed his journalistic skills while writing for the Harvard Crimson. And in one of the smartest moves ever, he happened to have married fellow Harvard graduate Elizabeth Lewis. She, by the way, is a true Harvard blue blood. She not only went to Harvard, both of her parents went to Harvard and have been there forever, and probably her grandparents too, I'm not sure, but that's another story. I diverse there. David and Elizabeth have two daughters whom he adores and enjoys spending time with whenever he can get away. He enjoys teaching them how to cook because, according to his wife, that is one of the things he loves to do, along with folding laundry. Couldn't quite figure that one out. Something of an anachronism in this day and time. Despite his youthful appearance, Dave has been at the Washington Post since 2000. It is the only job he has held since graduating college. And get this, it's what he always wanted to do and what he still enjoys doing. He, of course, has had to work at it a bit. Now, Guy mentioned just a moment ago that he previously covered Congress, the federal bureaucracy, the DC police, sometimes known as blowhards, diehards, and murders. He also covered the environment now, which afforded him the opportunity of writing about the World Championship muskrat skinning contest and delving into such matters as whether or not the government should fund robo-squirrel and a particularly riveting study of duck genitals. Now, this is all true. However, on a serious note, if there is a mantra to which he subscribes, it is this: David Farenthold never takes things at face value. He's the kind of journalist who represents, by his own admission, an absolutely swashbuckling vital force for truth at a time when the country absolutely needs that. I think David Farenthold is quite simply a reporter's reporter. Rosalind Helderman, his longtime colleague at the Post, who is also a friend from his freshman days at Harvard, had this to say. Here's the thing about Dave. Most journalists are known as either reporters or writers. They excel either at digging for information and turning up scoops, or at crafting sharp, moving, understandable prose. For some reason, few are truly exceptional at both. Few other than Dave. She went on to say a lot of other nice things, but time doesn't allow me to do that. Her last statement, however, was, I often say there are no perfect reporters or people, but Dave Farenthold gets pretty close. Now that's a heck of an endorsement. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man our president has called a really nasty guy, David Farenthold.
Well, it's only gonna be downhill from there. I just want to first of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thanks to Winthrop and the South Carolina Humanities for hosting me. It's always weird. It's weird as a political reporter to be in South Carolina during primary season and to be in a room where literally no one is running for president. I think. Is anyone here running for president? Anybody on the fence doing a Joe Biden thing? No? Okay. We're just going to have to carry on. So they've asked me to talk about the state of the Fourth Estate, which is a pretty lofty, high-level thing. And I should tell you that I am not a high-level visionary. I'm not really even a low-level visionary. One of the goals of my journalism career has been not to ever rise up the management ladder at all. And by God, I've done it. I've been a reporter. I've had the same entry-level job for 18 years. So I can't give you the perspective of management, but I can tell you a little bit about what I've seen 18 years on the ground floor about this business that I love. So the first thing I want to say tonight is that I'm actually optimistic about the future of journalism, despite all the problems I'm going to talk about. I say that first because if you think that I'm insane after hearing that, there's still time to leave and have dinner somewhere else. There's Chick-fil-A still open. But I am optimistic about the future of journalism. Well, the thing that we produce, accurate, concise, easy to understand information about the world around us, that's journalism, and people want that now more than ever. Right? We have lots of problems. Many of them come from the fact that we've kind of stumbled into the 21st century, holding on to things we used to do in the 20th century and believing that eventually the world's going to come back around to them. But we still produce something that people really, really want. You start with that, so I'm optimistic. I'm going to talk about the business side of journalism first, and I'll tell you a little bit about the journalism side. The business side is, probably you guys know this story, but it's a really amazing story that begins basically when I started in the business. All right, in 2000, the overall revenue for newspapers, advertising revenue, was $65 billion a year. Right then, like the second I got to the Washington Post, it started to fall. And it's now at about $23 billion a year. It's about a third of what it was. And there's some obvious culprits for that, right? Craigslist killed our classified ads. Google and Facebook took away our audience, and as our role as kind of the curator for information you see. Now, then Facebook gave that curation to your Uncle Larry, who believes the moon landing was faked, but they took it away from us. We didn't lost that role. And we lost a monopoly on all kinds of things we had because we were the only thing that was delivered to your door every day. Even cat jokes, right? If you wanted a cat joke back in the great old days of newspapers, you had one choice, Garfield. It wasn't funny, but it was all you got. And we had this idea that agglomeration of newspapers, this thing that we produced, was something that people would always want. And we did not see the change coming. I mean, from when I started, I'll give you the view of how we saw ourselves when I started in the business. Obviously, our business was change, to cover change, right? Change in politics, change in economics, change in the world. That's what we did. We told you about what was new, what was changing in the world. On the other hand, we felt like our business was immune from change. It was never going to have to change. When I started in 2000, we've been growing fat on a local advertising monopoly, the Washington Post as well as everybody else. We made huge profit margins every year. And when I joined the paper, other friends of mine got jobs at consulting firms or investment banks or wherever. I didn't feel like I was joining a business. I mean, yes, I knew that there was somewhere somebody was selling ads and selling subscriptions, but the idea that it was a business subject to the laws of business, that it might someday go away or lose its market, that was like impossible. It felt like joining like the phone company or the CIA or something, in that you felt like you were joining this thing that would never go away. It was an institution like immune from change, outside of history looking in. And that was completely wrong. We believed that in the fiber of our bones, but it was totally wrong. And so when the internet disrupted the business model we had, it wasn't just that we were flat-footed and not ready for it. We were sprinting in the other direction. We were building giant buildings. We were hiring new staff, building bureaus, taking out big loans to do all of it on this idea that 30% profit margins would go on forever. And then when the change hit us, we didn't even really know what it was. And one of the craziest things we did was when the internet brought us new customers, instead of selling them the product like any actual business, we gave it to them for free. Washington Post certainly did, and a lot of other places did. So we taught our customers to see us as we saw ourselves, which was an institution that was so stable and so sacred and so immutable that you didn't even have to worry about paying for it. It would always be there. So that was wrong, and at the same time we should have been realizing it was wrong, we were now teaching it to our customers to see ourselves that way. Now, I didn't work on the business side of the paper, but I just want to give you a sense of the way that attitude felt to me as a reporter, which was for long after it should have been true. It's 2010, 2012, the only metric of success for a reporter at the Washington Post was, did you make it on the front page of the physical newspaper? Not the home page, the front page of the actual paper. There were meetings devoted to this every day, huge amounts of editorial input, where editors would gather together and pitch their stories and crap on each other's stories and try to get their stories on the front page. And if, as a reporter, you got on the front page of the paper, that was such a huge success that I had a colleague who believed that if you ever got your story on the front page of the paper, what you did the next day was you came in late, talked to everybody, made sure everybody saw what you did. Then he would write a story of local officials reacting to this immense news that he had gotten on the front page. He'd write that the next day, and then he'd take the rest of the week off. Because you've been to the mountaintop. Like, what else can you do? If you've been on the front page, that's all that matters. That was true long after it ceased, that the front page of the physical paper meant anything, or meant nearly as much to our readers. So now we're kind of on the far side of this. We're in the world that we didn't see coming. Newspapers have been eaten up by hedge funds, have been sold off for parts, sold off for their real estate. There's been a lot of examples of that just in the last few weeks. One great example is Denver. Denver used to have 2 great daily papers. It did until 5 years ago. Now it barely has one. Denver Post has been bought by a hedge fund that's basically sucking the life out of it from the inside. So that story has played out at a lot of local and large newspapers around the country. So what makes me an optimist? I told you I was an optimist at the beginning. Well, for one thing, my newspaper is owned by the richest man in the world. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post a few years ago and has given us, has exempted us from this sort of broader problems that are happening in the newspaper business. By the way, I feel like the rich, benevolent rich guy is a time-honored ownership trope in the newspaper business that we could use more of. Local rich guy, national rich guy. If I could give advice to the Pulitzer Committee as to like one thing they could do to change the economic model of newspapers, rings, Pulitzer rings. Think how much satisfaction rich guys derive from showing off their Super Bowl rings to each other. If we could make Pulitzer rings, maybe a belt buckle, something that makes rich people jealous, that's the key. That may be the key to revitalizing some of these papers. But there's more than that. It's more than my own paper situation. At the New York Times, for instance, they've put a huge amount of investment in digital revenue, in growing their, in reaching internet audiences, capturing them, getting them to subscribe. And they've now reached this level where digital revenue is actually starting to replace some significant portion of what was lost when print declined. Now, I have to say that both us and the New York Times, we've had help from a man named Donald Trump, who views governing and politics as sort of a daily reality show. That certainly benefited us. The alarm or the interest or whatever you want to call it has brought readers to us. And we're already thinking about when Trump exits the stage, whenever that is, how are we going to keep those readers if we don't have him stirring up drama for us every day? Unless we let Kanye West. And let me tell you, please do not let Kanye West. It will help our business model. But I still think it's not a good idea for the country. Other papers have done great things, including I was just reading something about the Seattle Times. They're marrying their teams of reporters and people from the business side who understand traffic, who understand what readers want, helping the reporters write stories readers want to read. Not clickbait, local politics stories, local sports, serious stuff. They're pairing reporters with people who actually know what the audience wants. 15 years ago, that would have been heresy. I think it's a great idea. We write to be read, so why not work with people who help us be read more? And also, I'm really encouraged by the rise of nonprofit news outlets. One in my home state of Texas is the Texas Tribune. It's a place that produces great journalism, but derives its revenue from places that we would have seen as totally off the reservation 15 years ago. Donations, major donations, and events. They have big events that gather people from around Texas together. So they want to create sort of an identity where if you care about this state, if you care about the future of this state, you belong to our organization, you gather together with us. I think those are great solutions. I hope they're scalable. Certainly there's been a lot of bad news about journalism, but I feel like there's enough good news to be optimistic for the future. Now I want to tell you about journalism, the part that I actually know about. And I'll tell you about political journalism. So I've covered a variety of things at the Post, but I've covered politics for the last 8 years. So that's the thing I know about, and that's the thing I'll talk about. For us, the last 4 years have not been our finest hour. The one of the things that Trump exploited about us was that many of us had cut our teeth as journalists in an era of Bush and Obama, when so much of Washington was about covering inaction, gridlock. And if action did take place, it was scripted. If presidents spoke, they were speaking with a purpose, and they were telling you about something they were actually going to do. There was so little drama that political reporting had become kind of an effort to create drama by skimming off the policy stuff and playing up things like winners and losers, horse race polls, personal drama. And the undergirding idea behind it all was that day-to-day Washington wasn't very interesting, and we had to work hard to make it interesting. One of my favorite examples of that is the tan suit controversy. I don't know how many of you remember that. President Obama one time wore a camel-colored tan suit. That's the whole story. And it was news for days. I mean, if you could imagine our current president came out wearing like an actual camel, it would be more that try to approximate how much coverage it got back in those quieter days. So then came Trump, who, as I said, was a skilled, experienced reality show star. And he figured out that he could exploit our inability to move quickly by, he'd say something one day, he'd insult the Mexican-American judge, he'd insult Rosie O'Donnell, he'd call for a ban on all Muslims entering the United States. He'd do something that would have been a career-ending gaffe for any other politician. And then as we got spun up to cover that thing he just said on the campaign trail, he'd do something else the next day that was equally scandalous or equally attention-grabbing. And then today's scandal erases the memory of yesterday's. And our readers existed all of a sudden in this sort of tornado of news where every day you were just sort of disoriented by how much was happening. And it was really hard for readers to follow the thread. It was hard for us to follow the thread of what had happened yesterday and to give you a real sense of what was happening over the longer term that was the most important thread to follow. That stuff will get lost, and it still gets lost. Now, obviously, Trump has played this card very well, but other people have benefited from it too in the Trump era. For instance, if you guys followed politics in the state of Virginia, you'll remember that like 2 weeks ago, every Democratic leader of Virginia, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general was embroiled in some sort of possibly career-ending scandal involving blackface, involving sexual assault allegations. It seemed for a few days like they were just all gonna resign and Virginia would just return to Queen Elizabeth's rule. But you may remember that, or you may not, because it's been subsumed by 5 other different things that have captured all of our attention, and those 3 guys are all still in office. They just waited it out and bet that the tornado would move on, and it did. So how do we deal with that as reporters? How do we cope with that? Well, I can't tell you how everybody's doing it. I'll tell you how I've done it. And that is to try to think very consciously about giving my readers threads to follow, to think of my stories and the lines of coverage that I do not as individual stories, but as threads. And I want to make sure I give readers chances to grab onto those threads in the helter-skelter of the news and follow them forward in time if they're interested, but also follow them backward to see the beginning. And if they lose my thread, I want to give them ways to grab it onto it and follow it again. So that happens in a couple different ways. One is thinking about 2016. I started in this line of coverage where I was writing about Trump's promises to give to charity. He'd obviously promised a lot. He had this idea that I think he learned from like Bruce Wayne, that to be like a sort of a dashing playboy billionaire, you had to be a dashing playboy billionaire philanthropist. And so he would often make these kind of grandiose promises to give money to charity. And I was interested in seeing if he'd followed it up. So I started trying to find evidence, basically trying to prove him right, trying to find evidence Donald Trump had given away the money that he said he'd been giving away for years. And so I did the normal things first. I asked the Trump campaign. They wouldn't talk to me. I tried to find people who knew Trump. They wouldn't talk to me. Trump himself wouldn't talk to us. So then I started trying to prove him right on my own by basically looking for charities that I thought, if Donald Trump had given money to anybody, he would have given money to these charities. These were things like he tweeted about them. They had events at Mar-a-Lago. His friends or contestants on Celebrity Apprentice had endorsed them. And I started calling them one by one and saying, hey, has Donald Trump ever given you a dime of his own money? Thinking like I'm not going to find all of his charity this way, but I might find the tip of the iceberg. And as I did it, I got out a legal pad and I started taking notes. So I'd write the name of the charity and then a little arrow and then the result. Had they ever gotten any money? What did they say? And I started taking pictures of it and posting it on Twitter. Now, I should say this idea met with some resistance from the Post social media team, who they regarded it sort of as like, I was like, I'm going to churn butter on Twitter and take pictures of it. Like, who would write on a notepad and then take a picture of it, post it online? But the advantage it had was it looked like work, right? You could see me working. You could see my list growing and the results right there in front of you. But also, it looked like nothing else in your timeline. And so if you saw it, you go, oh yeah, the notebook guy, I remember him. I'll connect that to things I've read. And every time a story spun out of that coverage, when I tweeted out the actual story, I'd tweet out the picture from the notebook. So then you'd say, okay, now this particular thing, Trump spent money from a nonprofit charity to buy himself a Tim Tebow helmet. Okay, that really happened. And now we're going to read this story, but I'm also going to understand the context. And if I see the context, then I can follow the thread. I've also started to write content that's just it's not a breaking news story. It's just for people who've lost the thread of what I'm doing, and they're coming back to it. Things like sort of a living question and answer. Here are the 7 questions about most important questions about Trump's businesses. Here are all that I know about them, and you can be sure that if you read this today, it's up to date. So if you lost track of this, or you've never heard of it, and you come to it for the first time, okay, now you can be up to speed. And the most important thing for me has been to try to change the way I write investigative stories. Before, the model was to spend all your time in secrecy, gathering all this information, and then once you had it all figured out, drop one enormous story. Don't let anybody know you're doing it until the very end, and then you do it all. And that was a tactic we had learned way back in the pre-internet days. And I'm not sure it ever worked, honestly. We thought it worked, but we didn't really know what our audience was reading and what they weren't. Now it's a terrible idea because you only get one chance for people to engage with that one big story. And if it's too long, or they're busy, or there's some other news going on, you lose them forever. One example of that is the New York Times' story. Some of y'all may have read this last year. They did this incredible investigation of Trump's history of what they call tax fraud within Trump's business. How Trump's father had used basically fraudulent means to take money that it was in his business and transfer it to his sons and avoid IRS gift taxes along the way. It was an amazing story. It took them 18 months. For some reason, they wrote it as one 400-paragraph story and dropped it all at once and on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the week where we were all trying to figure out if Kavanaugh was going to be confirmed. So I read it to the end. Obviously, I'm a highly motivated consumer of that content, but not a lot of other people did. And then it was gone. It just sank to the bottom of the sea. And unless you saw it that day and engaged with it that day, you missed it. I've tried to write my stories a little bit at a time. When I know something, I'll write it, both because I want maximum chances to catch your attention and bring you into what I'm writing about, but also because writing it a little bit at a time lets readers know, hey, this guy's interested in this topic, and can bring in stuff you didn't know you were looking for. That brings me to the last way I've tried to adapt to this modern sort of news environment, and that is by trying to involve readers themselves. If you can build up a thread and build up a following, people care about what you're doing, you can leverage those people and the things that they know and the places they know to look that you've never thought of, and use that to benefit my reporting. One of my favorite examples of this, in 2016, I hit a place in my reporting where I thought I just hit a dead end, which was I was writing about this thing called the Donald J. Trump Foundation, this charity Trump had started in the 80s. It has his name on it, mostly gave away other people's money. But one of the things I found in the foundation's tax returns, it was a tantalizing mystery. In 1989, the Trump Foundation gave a $7 grant to the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts of America gave out a $7 grant. It's the smallest donation in the history of the Trump Foundation. You know there's a story there. You know there's a story to that, right? Who gives a $7 grant? So I called the Boy Scouts. They wouldn't talk to me. Trump wouldn't talk to me. I thought, I've been watching this disappear into the mists of history. I'll never know the answer to this. This is just an unknowable fact. And so I didn't tweet it out to my followers as a way of saying, help me with this. It was more like, damn, I hit a brick wall. Let's look at this and ponder what might have been. So I just said, look at this. Isn't this crazy? A $7 donation. And without my even asking for it, because I'd created this community of people all following the same thread, they picked it up. And watching it was like watching, in the movies, like watching a supercomputer try to solve a problem. First, they decide, well, maybe it's popcorn. If anybody here was popcorn, if anybody here was a Boy Scout or has Boy Scouts, The Boy Scouts make you sell popcorn, and it's not very good, and it's not like the cookies, but that's all they have. And so these people on Twitter start saying, well, maybe it was popcorn. Maybe Donald Trump bought Boy Scout popcorn. That's the reason for the $7 donation. So the popcorn company has a Twitter handle, and so someone tweets at them, hey, at Trails End Popcorn, what did a tin of popcorn cost in 1989? The answer was $5. Okay, well, throw that off to the side. It wasn't the popcorn. Then, this is all happening within like an hour of when I had originally posed the question. Somebody else, another reader who I've never met, will probably never meet, finds a copy of a newspaper from 1989, like from somewhere in New York, like Poughkeepsie, that has been digitized. And it's not just been digitized for the stories, the ads are also digitized. And they find in that paper an ad from October 1989, which is when this donation was given, saying, sign your son up for the Boy Scouts this year in New York. Registration is only $7. So because of that, we know that a man that had just written a book, The Art of the Deal, about how he had so much money he didn't need anymore, he'd used a tax-exempt charity's money to pay for his son's entrance in the Boy Scouts. If I hadn't asked for help, if I hadn't thrown myself into the mercy of my readers, I would never have known that. And that's the advantage of creating a community. It's all kind of looking in the same direction. So I hope that other news outlets are learning the same kind of lessons. I think 2020 will be a really important test, whether we can write about a presidential campaign in a way that's more devoted to policy questions, more devoted to the real-world impacts of these candidates than the last one. And I feel like, honestly, I hope that works. I hope that we can do that in 2020, because I feel like looming over all this is the subject of climate change. And that's a subject that is the ultimate story that it matters every single day, but doesn't make the news every single day. And if we can't find a way to keep that story, which could end up being the story of our lives, in front of readers and enable them to follow that story in a way that's coherent, we really have failed at a pretty grave task that has fallen on our shoulders, the task of providing service, providing information people need. Now, I'm going to end here, and the last thing I want to say is to talk to you, the reader. If you care about journalism, what would I like you to do? What would I ask you to do? I was thinking this moment about something that John Adams said. John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. You probably heard that quote. I used to read that as a young journalist and think that was like a statement of like gravity. Like it was like a law of the universe. That's the way things always are. Facts are stubborn things. Truth wins out in the end. That's the way the world works. But that's not the law. That's not the way it is, obviously. That's not some law of the universe. Think of all the times in the history of our country, in the world around us today, when facts don't win out. Facts are overcome by people in power. So that statement, facts are stubborn things, it's not a fact of the universe, a law of the universe. It's a goal for you and me. And if you and me care about facts, if for facts to be stubborn things, we have to be stubborn first. And for me, that means holding tight to the values of truth and objectivity, fairness, while we change everything else about the way that journalism works. But for y'all, I would ask you to be stubborn in your habits and to remember in your daily habits to support and reward good journalism. Now, that means, first of all, paying for the journalism, subscribing to newspapers you read so they stay around, but also rewarding us with your shares on social media. Maybe send one to your Uncle Larry who doesn't believe the moon landing happened. Try to convince him. But also defend our good name to people who call us fake news, and help us out if you can. If you see something that's newsworthy, let us know. It's not just a job for me. It's the job of my life and a job that I love, but to keep this going requires you guys as well. So like I said, for facts to be stubborn things, we have to be stubborn first. And I think we will be. And I think that that's enough to overcome all the problems I've laid out tonight. So as I said, I'm an optimist, and I hope maybe now some of y'all are too. So thank you.
Please give your questions to Dr. Disney, and she will pass them to Beryl. But in the meantime, if you guys want to start your conversation.
Oh, yeah, we do. Okay. You said so much there that I'm not quite sure I know where to start, but I am going to start with that thing about the fourth estate, because alluding to the press as the fourth estate sort of acknowledges a certain sphere of influence, power, and status, right? Well, According to Gallup in 2016, only about a third of Americans trusted the mass media. Before that, a majority of them. You say, however, that you are optimistic. I'm just wondering, has the term outlived its usefulness, and has the press lost not only its shimmer, but its power?
We definitely lost a lot of our shimmer. But I think we do have a lot of power now. And I think that power that we have comes from our restraint and our responsibility. You know, there's a lot of people out there who will claim to tell you about the world. Our value is that when we tell you it's right. But that requires a lot of restraint and caution on our part. But I think the value of the mainstream news media in that people believe it to be true and trust our facts more than other people, and we work harder to get them. That's a really valuable thing, and I think there's still a lot of power in that in society. Although there are a lot more people calling themselves the news media now, there's a relatively small set of people who abide by the kind of ethical and proof standards that we would regard as basic for journalism.
You give the public a lot of credence, but has the public, because of the bombardment of news, quote news, and the challenges of, quote, fake news, has the public lost its ability to discern that which really is news?
I don't believe so. I guess there's always been, it's maybe more visible now because now they can tweet back at us, but there's always been a large set of people who didn't believe us, who mistrusted the news media, or didn't like that we said things that contradicted their view of what ought to be or what is. I think that's been with us throughout. I mean, just today in the news, Justice Clarence Thomas said that New York Times versus Sullivan, the libel case from 1964, was wrongly decided, and was recalled from me. I was reading something about the history of the New York Times versus Sullivan case, and that was a time when, in the civil rights era, sheriffs in southern states were suing northern newspapers because they believed they were tired of the coverage saying that they were mistreating people, and they wanted to push back against it. So I think that impulse of people who don't like what the press is reporting has always been there. It may be a little more visible now, but I don't think there's any proof that I don't see any evidence that that problem is worse now.
Okay, we're going to take one of your questions. Will Trump's tax returns ever be made public?
It's hard to know. I'm going to bet yes. Certainly there are legal mechanisms to get them that the House Democrats have, and they're trying. I don't know how many people will have to resign before that happens or what kind of legal fight will have to happen, but I do believe they will come out.
Okay.
If you have them tonight, I would like to see you afterward.
Question number 2 from the audience. Do you think the use of social media benefits journalism?
Yes. I do think it benefits journalism. There's certainly downsides. There's certainly, it allows a lot of people to spread things that they think are true and are not, the original fake news. But for us, it enables us to reach readers and talk back and forth with them in a way that we couldn't before. It enables us to regain some of the role of curation, of playing a role in getting our news in front of you that we lost when Google and Facebook became sort of everybody's first read. So, I mean, it's sort of like the tide coming in. I can't really, it's going to happen regardless, but I feel like there are some really good things about it that we're starting to adapt.
Let me expand on that a little bit, because the web, the social media, the blogs, etc., often are referred to now as the fifth estate. And one has to question whether or not this is more detrimental to the press than beneficial.
To me, the worrisome thing is that people, there's that old adage, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. I think there are people who may come to believe that there is journalism out there or something that calls itself journalism that tells them the facts they find pleasing and that they don't have to make an effort to read things they find unpleasant. There's certainly refuges for you on the left and the right if you want that. On the right, you can believe Trump is the subject of a deep state coup. On the left, you can believe Mueller is about to indict Trump's entire family. There's certainly ways for people to retreat into fantasy worlds that probably existed in some form or another before the internet, but they're much more readily available now. So that sort of opinionated world that calls itself semi-journalism. I don't think it helps our cause because we're often lumped in with those folks. But again, I feel like I can't do much about it, so we have to just adapt to it.
Okay, we're going to have to move along here. We've got lots of questions. Do you think crowdsourced journalism combined with traditional journalism is more efficient than other methods?
I found it to be crowdsourcing. To me, is a tool for using when I've exhausted every tool that I have. When I feel like I've pushed my reporting as far as I can go with the traditional methods that I have. Make phone calls, public records requests. Sending out myself or freelancers to places and talking to people. If I feel like I've gotten to a place where I know I want something and I can't see the next step that gets me there, that's when I often turn to crowdsourcing, both because you're often in a position where if you don't, you're going to get nothing, and also where you've shown to readers, look, I've done everything that I can, and I'm giving as a result, I'm giving you a more specific request to look for. If I could tell one story that illustrates that to me. In the course of the 2016 reporting on Trump's foundation, we found that he had used the foundation's money to buy a painting of himself. All of you would do that. Don't tell me you wouldn't. He bought a painting of himself at an auction at Mar-a-Lago, which is fine. But then he used his charity's money to pay for it, which is maybe not fine, because as a tax-exempt charity, the Trump Foundation can't spend its money to benefit him personally. It can only spend its money for charitable causes. And so once we knew that the charity had paid for this painting, I need to know where it is, because that would tell me something about whether it's being used properly. Is this charity's asset hanging on the wall of like a children's hospital, or is it hanging on the wall of Trump's business? And I tried to think of all the ways I could to go look for it, and I couldn't. I couldn't figure out a way efficiently to go search every Trump property in the country. So I put it out on Twitter that I was looking for this. A reader in Atlanta figured out, the answer is TripAdvisor. She went to the TripAdvisor page for Trump's golf resort at Doral, where there's like 500 user-generated photos of all different parts of the resort, like bathrooms, golf tees, whatever. And she found a picture of that painting hanging on the wall of the sports bar at Doral in one of these user-generated photos. I never would have thought of that. And so then we were going to send a freelancer to Doral the next day to take a picture of it, see if it was still there. But we didn't even have to wait that long. After I tweeted out that we had found at least that it had been at Doral, we don't know if it's still there now, another journalist, a guy named Enrique Acevedo, he works at Univision in Miami, sees that tweet. He works 4 blocks away. After his newscast is over that night, he goes and finds it hanging on the wall. So we went from, at 11 o'clock that morning, knowing that this painting had been purchased, but no idea where it was or, if it still existed, to at 12:30 that night, having found it on the wall, breaking the law. That's the kind of thing that's only possible with social media if you give people a specific enough ask. Find this painting.
Okay. All right. I know the answer to this one, but with writing stories, trying to cater to the audience, do you risk losing some of the facts of the story or not quite doing a well-rounded job covering that story?
I feel like the purpose of writing is to communicate what you think are the most important facts. So whatever you think is most important, that's getting that across is the main thing you're doing as a writer. I try to use all kinds of different tools as a writer to make my reporting interesting. And that includes, very simple things like varying sentence length, having interesting quotes, like finding quotable people to make it lively. So I used to when I covered the environment, I covered the Chesapeake Bay, where the main problem in the bay is like invisible algae bloom. So you cannot imagine a more difficult subject to make interesting to people. So after that, everything's been easy. But I feel like the main goal is to sort of make it concise, but to get across the facts you think are most important. So I don't feel like I end up in a situation where I'm leaving out a fact just because it would make the story boring. Often if it's interesting, if I think it's an important fact, that's what's most interesting about the story.
When news is analyzed, interpreted, and discussed by news media pundits and editorialists, can it maintain objectivity and the accuracy of the factual information itself?
This is, I guess, mostly a question about TV, or I take it as a question about TV.
Well, you're on TV.
Yes. That's been a really interesting experience for me. I'd never really done a lot of television before 2016, And my experiences in 2016 were not very encouraging. Often on CNN particularly, they'd have me on to talk about my reporting about Trump's charity. They'd say, okay, David, tell us about the things you just learned. And then as kind of like a palate cleanser to show the readers that CNN did not hate Donald Trump, they would then have me be followed by like a panel of morons, basically arguing, like a bipartisan panel of morons. And so they were bipartisan in their lack of knowledge, but they certainly knew nothing about what I had just talked about. So here I've spent all this time reporting my story and getting all the details right and making sure nothing is wrong. And then they turn me off, so you can't see me on your screen anymore, but I can hear in my earpiece the next segment beginning, and whichever one of the Democratic or Republican person would start talking, and like often the first words out of their mouth would be wrong. Factually incorrect about the thing I just talked to you about. And there's no correction, so there's a huge amount of that where TV networks prioritize somebody who could comment about anything, and they prioritize their point of view rather than their fidelity of the facts. I think, I'll put in a plug for MSNBC, they often have me on to talk about what I know about, and they're interested in having me tell the story. And they don't often do that thing where then the palate is cleansed by like people without brains talking about it from a variety of perspectives. But that's a hard thing for TV to do, right? They have to fill so much time, and there's a temptation for them to get people who can speak about anything without asking whether they know about whatever they're talking about.
Okay. What has your paper done to separate factual news from opinion? The two seem to become intertwined and inseparable.
That's a good question. One of the weird things I talked about is kind of the weird conventions that newspapers have that we thought readers understood, or that we thought were like sacred just because we'd been doing them a long time, like Garfield, was the like divide between the news and the editorial side. And so we thought you knew as a reader, okay, well the first 18 pages of the A section are news and it's all totally objective. But then when you flip to that 19th page, there's a magical transformation, and everything there is opinion, and we understand that you know the difference, which I'm not sure people ever really knew the difference. But that now we don't even have that flimsy barrier of one page to the next to separate it. Everything is right next to, it's all jumbled together on the website. I think that there is a place for opinion journalism in journalism today. I think the best place for it is things that are signed by somebody's name, columns, op-eds. I don't think that the unsigned staff editorial has as much of a place as it used to, just because it confuses people so much.
But news stories are signed as well. So
that's true.
What makes you think the public would make that distinction?
Well, a column that has somebody at the bottom, Joe Smith is an advocate for ethanol who works for this company. There's some disclaimer at the bottom of those stories that tells you why the person's giving you their opinion. But the unsigned editorials where it's like the Washington Post is covering Ralph Northam for governor. The Washington Post endorsed Ralph Northam for governor. In our mind, oh yeah, well those are two totally separate functions of the same paper. But I think it confuses readers, and I think we should, spoken as a true news side person, I think we should try to do a lot less to avoid confusing people and to avoid writing opinion that looks like news.
On the topic of social media, and I think you touched on this earlier, how can media play a role in reporting an ever expanding story?
I feel
or was
like
that never expanding.
My view on social media is it's a very valuable tool, but also a huge temptation. Both the temptation to waste all of my time, all the good things that Twitter gave me in 2016, it took back in 2017 when I just spent the whole year staring at the screen trying to figure out who was going to be fired next from the White House and not doing my own job. The persona that I've tried to present on social media is super earnest, super just interested. I'm an interested person. I'm going to tell you what I know and what I'm interested in. I'm not going to use it as a chance to make jokes or to be snarky or to sort of play along with it in a way that makes you think that I hate Donald Trump or that I'm out to get him or I'm out to mock him. One of my favorite Twitter interactions was in 2016. There was a guy, I was asking the public, hey, anybody know any place Donald Trump gave money? I'm looking for proof of his donations. Does anybody know a charity that I haven't heard of maybe that got money from him? And there's a guy who's like a pro-Trump person who I think worked for the campaign and worked down in Florida, who started tweeting at me, I know where Donald Trump gave money, but I'm not going to tell you because you wouldn't report on it fairly. And just like, it was like if you have a fight with your sister when you're 8 years old, like you wanted to make me mad, right? He was just trying to bait me into an argument. And I was like, that is great news. I'm so glad. Here's somebody who knows where Donald Trump gave money. This is what I've been looking for. This is so great. Tell us about where it was. No, I will not tell you. You're not trustworthy. So it finally got to a place where I was like, I'm going to guess a letter. Is there an M in your charity? Does your charity have an M in it? And finally, overwhelmed by my earnestness, he gave it up. He gave up a name. And it turned out it was like a charity that I had already called, and it was, on the list. Trump had never given them any money. But afterward, I was like, it didn't work out this time, but thanks for participating. This is exactly the kind of input we need, because I'm trying to send a signal to other people that, I'm not here to fight. I really want to know what the answer is. I'm trying to get an answer even out of this angry, uncooperative person. So finally, I was like, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. And all in public. And then in private, he sent me a message. He was like, you're a terrible person. He was like, he wanted to have the fight in private that we couldn't have in public. But I feel like that kind of persona where I'm not going to be a pundit. I'm not going to tell you what Donald Trump should do or has, where he went wrong. I'm just going to tell you what I know. I think it's a really valuable role for reporters to play, but it can go wrong so fast, right? One tweet, one interaction that puts you over the line can poison all your other work.
So this person called you a terrible person. How did you really feel when the president called you a nasty person?
Well, I should say, first of all, that in my covering politics, the worst abuse I've ever gotten from any politician's fans is Bernie Sanders fans. They were the worst when I wrote things about Bernie they didn't like in 2015. Second place, Rand Paul people or Ron Paul people. I like them because they often use very cinematic insults. Often their insults are like, Ron Paul is the guy in Gladiator, and you are the evil emperor that he's trying to there's always a Star Wars connection. Those people, there's always a narrative where I'm playing a character and Ron Paul is another character. Trump's people, so the abuse from Trump and his people has been much less than either one of those. But I did have this interaction with Trump in 2016 where early on in the campaign, Trump had said he'd held a fundraiser in Iowa where he said he was he was counter-programming a Republican debate. He was having a feud with Fox. It's hard to imagine now, but he's having a feud with Fox, and he didn't want to go to their debate. So he had his own thing. Well, the other Republicans were debating in Des Moines. Trump had his own standalone fundraiser for veterans to kind of counter-program the main Fox debate. And in the course of that thing, he said, I've raised $6 million for veterans tonight, including $1 million from my own pocket. I'll give $1 million from my own money to veterans. Now, that's a really important thing to check, right? Obviously, it goes to two things at the heart of Trump's campaign. A, that he's rich and therefore successful and a good manager. B, that he cares a lot about veterans. So we have to see if that's true. Did he actually give the money? And it took me months and months and months until finally, 3 months after that original promise was made, Corey Lewandowski, who was Trump's campaign manager, called me and said, okay, fine. I could tell you now Donald Trump has given away the $1 million he promised to veterans. But I can't tell you who got it or in what amount, did he split it up? Was it all at once? Nothing about it. It's all secret, but just trust me, he's given away this $1 million. And that was not true. I sort of then embarked on this public Twitter search to find any of the money and couldn't. So finally, Trump himself called me to say that now he'd given the money away. So when Lewandowski told me the money had been given away, total falsehood. After my searching on Twitter, not finding the money, 3 or 4 days later, Trump actually gave the money away. Trump calls to tell me this. This actually is the last time I talked to him. And he said, I gave this money to this group. It's called the Marine Corps Law Enforcement Foundation. And I said, well, why did it take you so long? You promised this money back in January. This is May. Why did it take you so long to give this money away? And he said, well, I had to vet the group that I was giving it to. I had to make sure they were okay. And it turned out that I knew from other reporting that this group that he gave the money to, they had given him a Man of the Year award the year before, this big black tie gala. Everybody talked about for the whole night about what a great guy Donald Trump was. I said, after that, you needed to vet them some more after that whole Man of the Year thing? And he said, oh yeah, that's true. And I said, well, did you just give this money away now because I was looking for it? Did you only give the money away because I was looking to find it and couldn't find it? Would it still be in your pocket if I hadn't made this big effort to look for it? And that's when he called me a nasty guy. But it was a really interesting interaction with him because he would be like, you're a nasty guy, you should be ashamed of yourself, I had no obligation to do this. And like, I don't want to argue about whether I'm a nasty person or not, who cares? But I did have some other like factual questions I wanted to ask him. He had a bunch of other people's money that he was sitting on that he promised to give the veterans that he hadn't. So I would say like, okay, well, fine, I'm a nasty person. What about that other money? And then he would start answering the question sort of factually, and then the answer would devolve into insults again. You should be so ashamed of yourself. Again, like trying to fight. And then I would ask him another factual question, and we would reset. We went through that like 4 or 5 times. It was the strangest interview. And then we said goodbye, and I've never talked to him since. I would love to talk to him again, but I have never talked to him since.
Because you're a nasty guy.
That's true. The word is out now.
Okay, one more money question here. How much money do you think the Trump family has made in profit off his presidency?
Oh, I'd love to know that. I don't know. The Trump Organization doesn't really release any public figures about profits and losses. We've done a lot of work to try to identify what's happening at particular Trump properties, and so I know some of them, like the Trump Hotel in D.C., which rents its ballrooms out to foreign embassies and lobbying groups, people who are there to influence the president. That's making a lot of money. But a lot of his other hotels in New York and Chicago and golf courses, a lot of them were scattered in places where he's not very popular now. Because before, the Trump brand was sort of hip, urban luxury. It was not, and so the places where he put those hotels were places that were coastal liberal cities. So those places are doing very poorly. What I don't know is how it all cancels out. In the end, is his politically motivated business going up enough to cancel out what he's losing, or are they losing money overall? I wish I had that kind of visibility, but I don't.
Okay. Now, you're going to have to pretend that you're on TV because we need succinct answers here to get through some of these. Okay. What do you think is the most significant non-Trump related story you've ever written? Remember those days back before? Yeah, okay.
I don't know. That's interesting. I got a fire chief fired one time on purpose, and I got a police chief fired once by accident. I'm trying to think about things that I did that had like a real impact. I don't know. There's a lot of them, I guess. I'll say the story that I'm most proud of, which was I used to write about government waste, and we discovered a huge cavern under Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, where the government has 28,000 file cabinets full of personnel records and like 300 people who manipulate the paperwork in there. It had never been written about, and we like got the government to let us in to see their paperwork dungeon. That was probably my greatest reporting achievement, was getting in the door of the paperwork dungeon. I don't know if it was really impactful or not.
Okay. What was the most absurd lead that wound up being true?
Probably Access Hollywood. When we first got the tip about what this video was, you heard a lot of crazy things. We've been chasing rumors about outtakes from The Apprentice that were supposedly terrible that nobody ever found. And so I didn't really believe it was going to be much of anything. I'd been conditioned to believe that it was not going to pan out. But then watching that video for the first time and, 30 seconds in, hearing Trump start to talk, you were like, okay, this is different. This is really different. And knew right away that was something that was really going to change things.
For those of you with the blank faces, this is the video in which Trump talked about his propensity for feline grabbing.
For groping women without their consent.
Okay. Now, no one covers state house and local politics today the way they used to. How does that problem get fixed with the shrinking available resources?
It's a really important question. The one answer that I've seen that's been happening a lot lately is nonprofit journalism. So I mentioned the Texas Tribune, but also ProPublica, which is a great national nonprofit outlet, has been funding state house reporting jobs in state houses around the country. That's the main way it's happening now, but it's certainly, state house journalism is in a terrible place compared to where it was even 10 years ago. And if any of you know state legislatures, if any of you are state legislators, I apologize. There's nobody who needs watching more than state legislators, and there's not enough of that going on now.
Are we moving into an era of political strongmen, and is democracy in danger of disappearing?
The second question first. No, I don't think democracy is in danger of disappearing. I think we've seen a lot of, in the last couple of years, the response to Trump has shown a lot of the robustness of the American democracy and the system that the founding fathers set up, the Constitution. But it's still just the whole system is just people. And if enough people give up their responsibilities and don't do the job they're supposed to within government, we've seen, I think, how, what Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell chose to do in the face of Trump's first 2 years shows you that certainly there are people who could ascend to that place who would not take seriously the job of congressional oversight. So I think I am a little more worried than I used to be. I used to see American democracy as something totally unshakable. But I think so far it's been tested and stood up to the test.
Okay. Your dedicated beat, Trump's Businesses and Charities, has gotten a lot of notice because of your work. What beats do you wish had a dedicated full-time national reporter other than your own?
Oh, there's a lot, but I think if I could sort of wave a wand and do it, one would be State House coverage. I think there should be a lot more State House coverage. Also, I think the IRS is a fascinating institution that has been, like, people don't like it, but it does a useful job for all of us, and it's been so gutted. All the things the IRS isn't doing and the sins of charities and taxpayers that are being missed, I just think that's such a valuable and interesting beat that at least we're not covering like we used to.
Would you put the FBI in the same category?
The FBI gets a lot of coverage. I mean, maybe they get used more, but they get a lot. It's not like there's not FBI reporters. There aren't really dedicated IRS reporters, at least at the Post.
Okay. Do you think nowadays there's too much news for people to process?
Yes.
Does it soften the blow of the truly serious news we see?
Yes, definitely. I think I think that there's a lot more news, political news. It's not like there's too much. I mean, you could lump Kanye West and Kim Kardashian in with that, and I don't. There's a lot more news about politics than there used to be, and it can be really hard to keep track of it all. I think it's slowed down. 2018 seemed slower, believe it or not, than 2017 in that way, as I think Trump kind of ran out of the initial energy he came into office with. But there certainly is a lot of news. It's hard even for me to keep track.
But you yourself talked about the explosion of news things that keep coming and coming before you publish it one day, and if you don't happen to see it, it's gone the next. So what kind of responsibility does the journalist bear for keeping those stories in front of us and making us attend to those things that are really important?
A huge amount. I mean, I think I talked about it a little bit. I think we have a huge responsibility to, if we think a story is important, to show you that by continuing to focus on it. I think we got so used to covering politicians where there was this ritual where they would show us how important the story was by, like, if they said there was a scandal or they committed a gaffe, they would, like, minimize it, try to say they didn't do it, then apologize and apologize again. Each one of those things was like a separate news cycle that would allow us to underline how important the thing was they had originally done. Trump doesn't do any of that, and we had been, Hillary did. We had been expecting that kind of him to follow that unwritten rule, and when he didn't, we didn't know how to deal with it. So a lot of our adaptation has to be, how do we give a story that we think is important a second day and a third day and a fourth day? How do we make it so it keeps going?
But what he's done instead is to create stories for you that divert your attention from whatever stories you've put forth.
Totally. And you have to be able to ignore some of that. I think that the answer is a limited number of people. Sometimes Trump's stories just aren't that interesting. Sometimes Trump's tweets aren't worth covering, and so you have to prioritize that. It's taken us a while, right? If you remember the Obama era, if the president said he was going to do something, usually he did it, right? And so when Trump at first said, like, I'm going to send the feds into Chicago, Chicago's murder rate is so high, we're going to, federalize law enforcement in Chicago. We all wrote about that. What would that mean? What would he do? And he didn't do it. So many of those things he said he was going to do and he never did. It's taken us a while to kind of calibrate the system for that, and then to try to cover the things that he says that it seems like they're actually going to produce a real-world result, and then take that extra energy and cover the stories we think deserve continuing coverage.
Has there been any coverage on whether or not Trump is running for president again?
He is, as far as I know.
Any coverage, okay. Would you consider that this job can have risks? For example, you seem to attack Trump. Do you think this can have a negative impact?
Well, I mean, two things. If you're talking about sort of like physical risk, there's certainly more of that for journalists in the Trump era covering politics than there ever was before. I mean, there was a cameraman who was like shoved and attacked by somebody at a Trump rally in El Paso last week. There was that crazy guy before the election who sent pipe bombs to CNN and other places. There certainly is, I don't go to Trump rallies. I mostly just sit at my desk. I don't think I'm in very grave danger. But I think there is more of a physical risk to doing the job of journalism now than there has been. And that's just in the U.S. Overseas, obviously, my colleague Jamal Khashoggi was murdered by the Saudis for being a journalist just a few months ago. So that risk certainly exists. To talk about risk not in a physical sense, but the risk of reputation, I really don't want to be seen as somebody who attacks Donald Trump. I'm going to write about Donald Trump. I want to show you the facts that I'm relying on and show you everything that I did to get his perspective in it. So that if you read the story, you don't say, oh, this guy hates Donald Trump. You see the links that I went to get it right.
Sort of you shoot the bearer of bad news. Huh?
That's right.
Okay. How do you believe journalism will evolve in the future?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that there are some things that we do now still that are left over from the old days that we will get rid of. Local columnists, for instance, unsigned editorials. There's things that are just accidents of the way the newspaper was put together in the 1950s that we're still doing. I hope that the future of journalism will be continuing to cover things that really matter in people's lives and learning a way to make them interesting. ProPublica, I've mentioned them a couple times. One of the great things they've done recently was they did this great story about this Navy ship, the U.S. Navy ship that collided with a tanker off Japan and killed, I think, 7 soldiers. And they had gotten a hold of a secret report that described all the different failures in the Navy that cascaded and it ended with this Navy ship crashing into another ship. And they didn't just write it, they made graphics, they made an illustration, they had an illustrator come in, and they took something that could have just been plain text and made it this incredibly compelling narrative that along the way of learning about these characters and wondering if they were going to live or die, you learned about all the policy questions and all the failures that created that. There's a way to do these stories that are important in a way that people find really interesting, and I think we can't give up on that. I think that that's going to be the future, is telling stories people care about in a way they find readable.
Okay, we've got less than 10 minutes here, and we're going to try to barrel through here. When there is not much to report, do you ever feel that your job is to entertain people?
It's been a long time since there was not enough to report. I mean, I feel like I want people to be entertained is probably the wrong word, but I want to be read. I want people to read what I'm writing about. And so, part of the job is to make this stuff interesting. You mentioned the story about the World Championships of muskrat skinning. That's one of my favorite stories because it was a story about the Chesapeake Bay and the changing environment told through this girl who was Golden Hill, Maryland. They have a World Championships of muskrat skinning. So they skin muskrats to see who can take the skin off a muskrat the fastest. And they also, on the same stage and the same night, have a beauty pageant. And this girl competed in both. She was a muskrat skinner, and then she did the beauty pageant, and her talent in the beauty pageant, when other kids sang the piano, played the piano or sang Wind Beneath My Wings, she skinned a muskrat on stage with her hair all done up. And it was an amazing story about this amazing person, but on the way, as you learned about her and her life, you absorbed something about the Chesapeake Bay and all the science that I've been writing about. And if you give people that kind of narrative momentum, they learn so much more. So I think being entertaining is okay, as long as you feel like you're telling people something they need to know.
Even if it's about muskrat skinning.
I had to see the muskrat skinning. There had to be somebody else has to suffer too.
Okay. There's a Politico story today that says the New York Southern office of the Department of Justice should be more feared by Trump than the Mueller report. What are your thoughts? And do you think there will be a GOP primary in South Carolina?
I mean, the Southern District of New York has jurisdiction over Trump's businesses, and obviously Trump's businesses have engaged in a lot of conduct that skirted the law or went up right to the edge of the law. It's possible. I don't know what they're going to find, but they've already found so much with Michael Cohen that there may be a lot more there. Both Southern District and Mueller, we really don't know where those cases are going or where those investigations are going. So at this point, it's hard to say which will be more damaging to Trump in the long run. Mueller could arrest Don Jr. tomorrow, or tomorrow he could issue a report saying the work is done, nobody else gets arrested. It's hard for me to judge those. And I don't know if there'll be a primary in South Carolina. I saw Larry Hogan today, the governor of Maryland, who I think wouldn't win, but it would at least would be an interesting challenge to Trump. He was saying Trump's done a bad job. He seems to be edging closer to doing that, so maybe so.
Okay, 3-minute countdown. Leaving aside the question of whether Trump can survive 2020, what will be the lasting impact of his administration on federal government's ability to deal with critical problems facing not only the U.S., but the world?
I worry about that, both because I think Trump has driven a lot of people out of the bureaucracy, both with policies he's made, with the government shutdown. He's, I think, on purpose caused people to leave the bureaucracy because a lot of conservatives feel like the bureaucracy should just be smaller. And I think that's taken away people who really knew what they were doing. And it's going to be hard for the next president to rebuild if he or she wants to. But on the other hand, it's possible that Trump has reminded us more of what the government does and why we care about it. And so it's hard for me to know really until we see who we pick for our next president to know, if the rebound will equal out what's been lost.
How do you remain optimistic about journalism, although there is a drastic decline in print journalism, which is a fundamental foundation of journalism?
It is. Print journalism is what drives everything else. TV journalism makes a lot of money, but I feel like a lot of their stuff wouldn't exist without us. I'm optimistic because I feel like there are some places that are figuring out the way to make money digitally. But the real question is in places like Columbia, South Carolina, or Charlotte, or Boston, where the big journalistic powerhouses and daily newspaper that's really struggling.
Do you think the journalism rate will ever go back up, or will social media wipe it out completely?
I don't think social media will ever wipe it out. I mean, I don't know there's certainly been a lot of layoffs and other bad news in the world of journalism lately, but God, I hope we don't ever get to a place where I'm relying on Twitter for my news. I feel like I can't even trust it for like baseball signings or basketball signings, so I wouldn't trust it for like national news.
Okay. This is a quickie. When did you realize your career was on the rise? 10 seconds.
It was definitely in 2016. Covering, I'd been at the Post for a long time, but the kind of national attention I got for covering Trump was unlike anything I'd done before.
It was that Iowa story about the money in the charities. Okay. How difficult was it to unravel these webs to find some semblance of the truth? And can we recover from the death of truth in this administration?
Well, it's truth may be dead to them. I don't think it's dead to the rest of us. And the unraveling the webs, that's why you do it. It's so much fun. I mean, that's why you get into this job, so you can solve mysteries. So these are hard, these are people who've worked hard to obscure the truth in some cases, but that's why you do it. I think it's not hard, it's fun.
Real mystery here. What's your view on climate change? And do you always look for the facts? State them in your newspaper.
Climate change is something that really, really worries me. I mean, as a father of 2 children, my children are 6 and 3. The world that is coming for them if we don't do something about climate change is really scary to me. But the problem is so big, and we seem to be running in the opposite direction of a solution. So it's not something I write about that often, but it's something that as a person I'm very, very concerned about, and I feel like we have a huge role to play in informing people, not alarming them if alarm isn't necessary, but informing people. And it's the ultimate thing that, like, you as an individual, it's hard for you to sort of look around yourself and understand what's going on. You need the perspective of somebody who's talked to the experts. That's what we can be.
Okay, final question. You've given us much, much, much to think about. What is the one thing you'd like for this audience to go away with?
The one thing, 2 things. Be optimistic, and also think about what you can do as readers to support journalism, right? I think it makes your life better, and obviously you guys care about it if you came out tonight, so think about ways you can support journalism and make sure it's there for you.
David Farenthold, thank you.
Thank you.
Please don't forget to take our evaluation. Again, tiny URL link or QR code. Thank you.
And here's a little gift for our guests.
Thank you very much.
It's the least